Thank you so much for the introduction. It's wonderful to be here. So I will be presenting tonight some material from a new book manuscript that I'm working on called Form, Matter, Substance, and I'll also be drawing on some previously published work. So my topic today is to ask whether and how hylomorphists can propose a distinctive solution to what's known as the grounding problem. And I will be explaining all of these technical terms as I go along. So to set up the problem, let's distinguish between coincidence theorists, that is people who, they're also known as pluralists or multi-thingers, who hold that more than one material object can occupy a single region of space-time. Their opponents, these are people known as monists or one-thingers, deny this claim. So they hold that each region of space-time can only be occupied by a single material object. So why should we believe that more than one object could occupy the very same region of space-time? That's certainly a startling claim which needs some motivation and defense. Often the case that's appealed to in this context is Alan Gibbert's famous Lumpl and Goliath example, which he proposed in his now classic 1975 paper, Contingent Identity. So I'll read to you the passage where he proposes this example. So Alan Gibbert says, "I make a clay statue of the infant Goliath in two pieces, one the part above the waist and the other the part below the waist. Once I finish the two halves, I stick them together, thereby bringing into existence simultaneously a new piece of clay, which he names Lumpl, and a new statue, which he names Goliath. A day later, I smash the statue, thereby bringing to an end both the statue and piece of clay. The statue and the piece of clay persisted during exactly the same period of time. And of course, they occupy the same space as well." So this is a case where we bring into existence the lump of clay and the statue at the very same time. They persist for a while in the same region of space, and they go out of existence at the very same time. So if we can find properties with respect to which these sorts of objects, like Lumpl and Goliath, coincident objects, differ, then by Leibniz's law, these objects would have to be numerically distinct, even though they occupy the very same region of space-time. So are there such properties? Here's Leibniz's law. So by Leibniz's law, I mean the principle that for all objects x and y, if x and y are numerically identical, that is the very same object, then x and y are qualitatively indiscernible. That is, with respect to all properties and relations, they share those as well. Sometimes when people speak of Leibniz's law, they have in mind the much more controversial converse principle, which is also known as the Identity of Indiscernibles. That principle says that for all objects x and y, if x and y are qualitatively indiscernible, that is, they have all the same properties and relations, then we should identify them. So think here of the famous case proposed by Max Black with the supposedly two numerically distinct spheres that are homogeneous and share all the same properties. That was supposed to be a counterexample to this principle. Okay, so when I say Leibniz's law, I mean the converse. I don't mean this controversial principle. There are, of course, some challenges that have been proposed even to the principle that I'm calling Leibniz's law. And one very prominent challenge is the problem of change over time. So remember, Leibniz's law says that if x and y are numerically identical, they have to have all the same properties and relations. What about change over time? Here, it seems that we're dealing with one and the same object that has some properties at one time, but different properties at a different time. That's why we consider it a case of change. So suppose one and the same person is at one time standing and at another time sitting. Why isn't that a counterexample to Leibniz's law? So I do think that's a very interesting and serious challenge, and of course we have to say something in response to it. But here, obviously what's relevant is that we need to index something to time. So what's relevant here is that one and the same object at one time has a certain set of properties and at a different time has a different set of properties. So I think we can find responses to this kind of challenge to Leibniz's law. Another important kind of challenge is to determine when a context singles out a genuine property or relation as opposed to something that just might look like it determines a property or relation. So for example, Lois Lane believes that Clark Kent cannot fly, but that Superman can fly, and yet, as we all know, Superman and Clark Kent are the very same person. So there must be something about that context that doesn't single out a genuine property that applies to the one and only person in question, Clark Kent, otherwise known as Superman. So some such response, I think, is available in this kind of case as well. So because there are responses available to Leibniz's law, and we need Leibniz's law to distinguish numerical identity from other relations that look like it but aren't numerically identity, I do believe we should adopt Leibniz's law despite the challenges that have been raised to it. Okay, now back to the problem about coincident objects. So the question was, are there genuine differences between spatiotemporally coincident objects like Lumpl and Goliath? If there are such differences, then by Leibniz's law, we would have to say that they're numerically distinct objects. Okay. So Karen Bennett, in a well-known paper that was published in 2004 called Spatiotemporal Coincidence and the Grounding Problem, introduced a distinction that she called the distinction between sortalish and non-sortalish properties. And she used the term non-sortalish properties to pick out the properties with respect to which coincident objects are indiscernible, and the term sortalish properties to pick out the properties with respect to which coincident objects apparently differ. So what are some examples of what you might think of as sortalish properties? Some prominent examples that you find in the literature on this issue are de-re modal properties. So de-re here contrasts with de dicto. These are modal properties, properties having to do with what's possible or necessary, what's essential or accidental to an object rather than ones that apply to a proposition or what is said. Those would be the de dicto ones. So you might think that the statue Goliath has the essential property of being essentially statue-shaped, but the lump of clay composing it has the de modal property of being only accidentally statue-shaped. Sortal or kind properties. So the statue Goliath might have the sortal or kind property of being a statue, whereas the lump has the sortal or kind property of being a lump of clay. Thirdly, properties pertaining to persistence conditions. What sorts of changes these objects can or cannot survive. So you might think the lump of clay can survive being squashed, but the statue cannot survive being squashed. And finally, there's other properties as well. For example, evaluative properties, such as being innovative, being valuable, being well-made, and so forth, which you might think apply more readily or perhaps only to the statue because it is an artwork and not to the lump of clay. So those are some prominent examples which might give us reason to think that these objects occupy, even though they occupy the very same region of space-time, are numerically distinct. Okay, so here's the grounding problem after all this setup, using Karen Bennett's distinction between non-sortalish and sortalish properties. Given that coincident objects share all of their non-sortalish properties, what grounds the apparent differences between them with respect to their sortalish properties? And here, grounds is really just another way of saying explains, right? We want, if these objects really are distinct and there are these differences between them, we want to know where these differences come from, given that these objects are otherwise so much alike. So that is the grounding problem. You might think that this is only a problem for coincidence theorists, and of course it is a very serious challenge for coincidence theorists, but even the opposing camp, monists or one-thingers, have a grounding problem of their own as well, because we wonder if each region of space-time is only occupied by a single object, then why is it that we apparently attribute to this single object these contradictory properties, or what look like contradictory properties? So monists as well have some explaining to do in this context. They cannot completely get off the hook just by saying we don't believe in coincident objects. Okay, now Karen Bennett in her paper considers 3 types of responses to the grounding problem. The first type of response is to try to find non-sortalish grounds, that is, to find an explanation which appeals to the non-sortalish properties of coincident objects to explain their apparent sortalish differences. The second strategy would be to wheel in our concepts, our conventional activity, to propose an explanation or a solution to the grounding problem. And the third strategy is what she calls primitivism. She thinks that the first strategy is hopeless because, after all, these objects are supposed to be indiscernible with respect to their non-sortalish properties. So how could it be? How could an explanation of the apparent sortalish differences be given that appeals to their non-sortalish properties? It looks to be hopeless. She also doesn't like the second strategy of appealing to our conceptual or conventional activity to solve the grounding problem, and she discusses options here in her paper. she thinks that this kind of option requires you to incur some unattractive commitments. Either the conventionalist or conceptualist has to say that our concepts or conventions can, with near magical powers, literally create objects, or that kind of theorist has to say that regions of space-time can be occupied by objects without any Sortalish properties until our conceptual or conventional activity introduces their Sortalish profile to these objects. And she thinks that either one of those options are unattractive. So she recommends that coincidence theorists not go for the first or for the second option. She thinks that the only hope for coincidence theorists is to go for some version of primitivism. Now, primitivism, of course, plays a difficult game here because primitivism might be accused of not solving the grounding problem at all. If you simply insist that these differences between coincident objects are brute, are primitive, cannot be further explained, then you might be accused of having simply dismissed the grounding problem or denied that there is a genuine problem at all, rather than formulated a solution to it. So even though Karen Bennett is ultimately sympathetic to monism, she defends a version of, or offers coincidence theorists a version of primitivism which uses a plenitude principle. And this plenitude principle says that any combination of properties where we distribute essential and accidental over these properties in any conceivable way, in every region of space-time is in fact instantiated. So there is, in the region of space-time that is occupied by Lumpl and Goliath, there's an object that is essentially statue-shaped, there's an object that is accidentally statue-shaped, there's an object that is accidentally heavy, there's an object that is essentially heavy, and so on. And because every conceivable modal profile is in fact instantiated, you don't have to explain why any one in particular is instantiated. So she recommends that this might be a way to go for the primitivist coincidence theorist. I'm going to propose a combination of the first strategy of appealing to non-Sortalish ground and primitivism, but I hope that I can avoid this kind of commitment to either the plenitude principle or to simply dismissing that the problem requires a solution. So my strategy is going to appeal to hylomorphism. So let me introduce you to hylomorphism. Hylomorphism is a doctrine that comes from Aristotle, and the way I construe it, it simply states that those entities to which it applies are in some sense compounds of matter and form. The word hylomorphism is just put together by taking the Greek word for matter, hyle, and sticking it onto one of the words for form, morphe, and you get hylomorphism. Aristotle introduces this doctrine in Book 1 of the Physics in the context of responding to a challenge about the possibility of change that he had inherited from his pre-Socratic predecessors. So Parmenides of Elea famously argued that change is logically impossible because if it were to occur, it would have to involve a transition either from something to nothing or from nothing to something, and either of those scenarios commit you to a logical contradiction, so he adopted the position that change was impossible. Aristotle wants to defend the more commonsensical view that, of course, change is possible. It occurs all the time. So the way he defended the possibility of change was by making use of the doctrine of hylomorphism to show that whenever change occurs, something, namely the matter or the underlying subject, persists through the change, while something else that was there before isn't there afterwards. That's why we consider it change. And he called that pair form and privation. So here's an example. When some wood, the matter, goes from not being a bed to being a bed, where not being a bed here would be the privation, and being a bed would be the form, the wood remains through the change, but the wood's not being a bed does not persist through the change. So here you have this combination of something persisting, but something else not persisting, which he thought you would need in order for change to be logically possible. Okay, now in my work, I've applied the doctrine of hylomorphism to a particular case, to the case of concrete particular objects, material objects. And I've argued in my book, The Structure of Objects, that to account for the mereology of these objects, that is to give the right theory of parts and wholes for material objects, we should attribute to them both matter and form. Now, in my current book project, Form, Matter, Substance, I continue this defense of a hylomorphic analysis of concrete particular objects, and I try to answer some of the questions I left open in the previous book. So, in my view, this kind of hylomorphic analysis of concrete particular objects is attractive, and it makes hylomorphism appealing over the non-hylomorphic competitors, because hylomorphists have this additional structural complexity that they can appeal to, these internal explanatory principles of matter and form, which play very different explanatory roles within a single object, and they can then use this apparatus to account for facts about, for example, the structure, the identity, or the unity of material objects. So that's the kind of use that I've been trying to make of Aristotle's doctrine of hylomorphism. Okay, now back to the grounding problem. So recently, in a 2014 paper called "Does Hylomorphism Offer a Distinctive Solution to the Grounding Problem?", Alan Sidelle has offered a challenge to hylomorphists, which I think is very important and interesting, and certainly one we should take very seriously. According to his challenge, so that he sets up a dilemma, and the first horn of his dilemma is that either hylomorphism offers no solution to the grounding problem, for example, by simply adopting a version of primitivism, or secondly, if hylomorphism offers a response to the grounding problem at all, its response is not proprietary to hylomorphists. And so when hylomorphists claim that they have something distinctive to bring to the table, it's really a case of false advertising. So I have to say right up front that I'm not very picky about solutions to the grounding problem. I am a hylomorphist and a coincidence theorist. If there is a solution to the grounding problem that can be shared among non-hylomorphic coincidence theorists, I would be happy with that as well. But I am, of course, already committed to hylomorphism for different reasons. So it would be attractive if we can put hylomorphism to use in our response to the grounding problem. Thirdly, Sidelle holds that an appeal to primitive differences, that is what we called earlier primitivism, is not so much a solution to the grounding problem at all as it is a denial that these differences need to be grounded. So that's the earlier problem I mentioned about simply digging in your heels and saying that these differences are brute. That in itself, I can see, would not be very satisfying. Okay. Now, we learned 2 lessons from Alan Sidelle's challenge. The first lesson, as I see it, is that if we do adopt a version of primitivism, that is, if we do appeal to primitive differences, which I think at some point we have to, then these differences have to be independently motivated. That is, they should not be simply introduced in order to provide a solution to the grounding problem. We should have other reasons to appeal to these basic facts. And the second lesson is that if the solution is distinctively hylomorphic, then ideally it should put to use the distinctively hylomorphic apparatus of form and matter in a way that is not also available to non-hylomorphic coincidence theorists. So let's see whether we can at least begin to meet these 2 desiderata. Now my talk is called Towards a Distinctively Hylomorphic Solution to the Grounding Problem, so I'm not going to tonight propose a full solution. I'm going to outline what I think is an attractive strategy, a kind of blueprint for hylomorphic coincidence theorists. And then I'm going to highlight some areas that I think are still open questions and interesting research problems for people who are working in this area, including PhD students, if anyone is looking for dissertation topics. Okay. Now, here's the general outline of the distinctively hylomorphic solution as I see it. So the first part is just the doctrine of hylomorphism, that concrete particular objects are, in some sense, compounds of matter and form, hylomorphic compounds. The second part is the version of hylomorphism that I've defended in my book, The Structure of Objects. That gives you the second claim that coincident objects differ with respect to their parts, and I'll say a little more about that in a minute. And then the third claim, what I'm calling non-modal essences, says that the modal differences between coincident objects follow from their distinct non-modal essences. So here, I'm really not so much, I'm mostly interested in a conception of essence that is non-reductive. So a conception of essence that does not take essence to be accounted for in terms of modality. I'm using the label non-modal because that's associated with the work of Kit Fine, but someone like Bob Hale, for example, who takes essential claims to be modal claims, but certain of them to be basic, could also fall under this rubric, and then we would call it non-reductive instead of non-modal conception of essence. Okay, so I'll say a little more about each of these 3 claims and how they would get us closer towards a distinctively hylomorphic solution to the grounding problem, as well as what still needs to be filled in future research. Okay, now according to the first claim, just the basic application of the doctrine of hylomorphism to the special case of concrete particular objects. A concrete particular object, let's call it O, is in some sense a compound of some suitable matter M and a form F. I say here some suitable matter because we have to also take into account that material objects can change their matter over time. And we have to account for the idea that, for example, what it is to be a screwdriver might not select a particular kind of metal or a particular kind of plastic. So what counts as suitable is determined by whatever else goes into the essence of a screwdriver. So there's these variables are being used in a different way here. Okay, so that's the first claim. Objects are compounds of matter and form. Now, all three of these parts of the claim of the application of the doctrine of hylomorphism to the special case of concrete particular objects need to be elucidated further by hylomorphists, and there are lots of different decision points that open themselves up, and depending on which way you go at each of these decision points, you get a different version of hylomorphism. So hylomorphists have to say more about how they're conceiving of the matter composing a concrete particular object, how they're conceiving of the form, and how they're conceiving of what I'm calling here compounding, or what I'm signifying in terms of the plus sign, the relation between an object, its matter, and its form. So even though it's a deceptively simple claim, there's lots more work and elucidation that needs to happen in order to get a specific version of hylomorphism. So my own version answers these three questions in the following way. I'm adopting what I'm calling a hylomorphic conception of matter. That is, I think of the matter composing a hylomorphic compound as either itself a hylomorphic compound, in the case where we're dealing with an object that just has a single material part, or a plurality of hylomorphic compounds. So matter isn't some other ontological category of stuff, for example, or prime matter. Rather, matter is just hylomorphic compounds or pluralities of hylomorphic compounds. Unless or until there is an empirically confirmed level in the compositional hierarchy where we're dealing with entities that are not structured wholes. And at that point, if there is such a point, then hylomorphists, I think, should say that their approach no longer applies below this level if there is such a level. So there is a modulo here that I didn't put on the slide. The second portion of the application of hylomorphism to the specific case of concrete particular objects has to do with how we construe form. This is something that I stayed neutral on in my first book, The Structure of Objects. I've since come to believe that we should think of forms as particular or individual, that is non-shareable entities of some kind. So here, if you look at the literature on Aristotle on this topic, there is, broadly speaking, two camps. There's the individual forms hypothesis proponents and the proponents of the universal forms hypothesis. According to the first view, forms are individual or particular. So even the members of a single kind, each have their own numerically distinct form, although, of course, these forms are similar in certain ways. According to the second camp, the universal forms hypothesis proponents, members of a single kind have numerically the same form. So Socrates' form and Plato's form is numerically identical. So I've now come around to adopting a version of the individual forms hypothesis. And the reasons here have to do with mostly cross-world identity. That's something I talk about in a paper called Essence and Identity. In addition, I think we should hold that these individual or particular forms are what I call here non-predicable. This sounds like a use-mention confusion, but I'm using the word predicable here in the way in which it is used in the literature on Aristotle when people talk about form being predicated or not predicated of matter. So I think to make a hylomorphic solution to the grounding problem possible, we should take these non-shareable particular forms to be non-predicable entities. This still leaves a large range of options which have to be decided on independent grounds. So even if forms are particular, they could be objects, in which case they would not be themselves hylomorphic compounds, they would be some other kind of object. They could be facts, they could be states of affairs, they could be states, they could be acts of creation, as Simon Evnine has recently defended in a book on artifacts, certain kinds of events. So even once you make that broad choice between individual versus universal, you still have a lot of options in each of those categories. Okay, the third claim concerns the relation of compounding. So how does the matter and the form compose the concrete particular object? Well, here I've argued also for independent reasons that we should think of the matter and the form as literally and strictly speaking proper parts of the object in the same sense of parthood. And those reasons have to do with Leibniz's law and what I call the weak supplementation principle, which I can go into more in the Q&A if anyone is interested. Okay, so that's my particular version of hylomorphism. That's how I construe the application of the general doctrine to the particular case of material objects. Now, the second claim comes out of this mereological construal of hylomorphism. The second claim was that coincident objects have different parts. So suppose an object O is composed of a single material part M, which is itself a hylomorphic compound. Let's call it O star. So O star is itself a compound of some suitable matter M star and some form F star. Then if O and O star come into and go out of existence at the same time, they are coincident objects, but they differ with respect to their parts. So F is part of O, but not of O star. Okay, so that's the second claim. Now, what role is played by the third claim, that coincident objects have distinct essences? So here I'm appealing to this non-modal or non-reductive conception of essence. Of course, if essences were construed in a reductive way as simply collections of derivmodal features, then this idea would contribute nothing to a solution to the grounding problem, because what we want to explain is why coincident objects have different modal features. So if in doing that we appeal to a distinction between their essences, and their essences themselves were reduced to collections of modal features, then we wouldn't have made any progress at all. Okay, so O's essence, or what it is to be O, is to be a compound of a certain form F and some suitable matter M. O star's essence, what it is to be O star, is to be a compound of a different form, F star, and some suitable matter, M star. So even though O and O star are coincident, they have distinct non-modal or non-reductive essences. And this is given to us by the Mereological interpretation of hylomorphism. So this is already distinctively hylomorphic, but we have to add to it a certain non-reductive or non-modal conception of essence. Okay, now why is this progress? Well, because remember when we talked about primitivism, that any appeal to primitive differences has to be independently motivated in order for our response to the grounding problem not to appear as a simple dismissal or denial that the grounding problem needs a response. So in this case, the appeal to basic facts about essences is required, I think, for reasons independently of the grounding problem. Because there's a more general question that has been around since Aristotle, at least, of how to explain why objects have the derivative modal features that they do. So in the posterior analytics, Aristotle uses the example of planets not twinkling versus planets being near. And he wants to distinguish two inferences, both of which are deductively valid. So you can infer from planets being heavenly bodies that don't twinkle, and the general claim that heavenly bodies that don't twinkle are near, that planets are near, but that wouldn't be an inference that any scientist would make. It would be, at best, a sort of evidential claim. As opposed to the inference from planets are heavenly bodies that are near, heavenly bodies that are near don't twinkle, therefore planets don't twinkle. So that second kind of inference is actually explanatory. It explains why planets appear to us as they do in terms of their nearness, rather than explaining their nearness in terms of how they appear to us. So even though both of these inferences are deductively valid, one is explanatory and one isn't. And so Aristotle, among other things, explains this difference by distinguishing between definitions or statements of the essence, which are taken as basic claims, and then other claims about the modal features of objects, which follow in some sense from these basic facts about essences. And then there's the well-known example that Kathrin uses to make the same kind of point. So contrast the following two claims. What it is to be Socrates' singleton set is to be the set that has Socrates as its sole member. Good. Versus what it is to be Socrates is to be the sole member of Socrates' singleton set. So here Kathrin wants to say there's something odd about the second claim, because when we say what it is to be Socrates, when we state the essence of Socrates, it's odd to appeal to some kind of necessarily existing abstract object, such as a set, to explain what it is to be this particular human being. But again, the singleton set and Socrates are necessarily coextensive phenomena. So if all that we have at our disposal is a reductive modal account of essence, we can't make this explanatory distinction. We can't capture this asymmetry. Okay, so this is just to say that there is independent motivation for this appeal to basic facts about essences, which I think we need anyway. So in my earlier paper, Essence, Necessity, and Explanation, I contrast Kit Fine's conception of essence with Aristotle's, and the way I read Aristotle, the type of explanation that we get, for example, in the biological works, is that to explain the modal features of one object, you end up having to appeal to basic facts about essences, about distinct but related phenomena. So, one of the examples I consider in the paper from Parts of Animals is the question, why do camels have multiple stomachs? Aristotle thinks that's a necessary feature of camels, but it's not part of the essence proper. So to explain this, you end up having to appeal to things other than camels. You have to appeal to desertous regions where camels live. You have to appeal to what camels eat, that they eat hard food, what kinds of palates they have. You have to appeal to what camels are ultimately made out of, which for Aristotle is earth, air, fire, and water in various ratios. And then the four elements themselves have essences. And so when you put all of these essences together, then you can explain these derivative modal features like camels having multiple stomachs. Here's another example, which is closer to the coincident objects case. In De Anima, for example, so let's take a human being to be a compound of a human body and a human soul. Soul here just translates the Greek term psyche, so it's not meant to have heavy-duty connotations. So that's just the application of hylomorphism to the particular case of living organisms. So how does Socrates end up with his modal profile? Well, some of Socrates' modal profile is conferred on him by having a human soul that is present in him, and this human soul confers on him a certain range of capacities. So in Aristotle's case, these are capacities like thought, perception, and nourishment. How does the soul confer these capacities, or how does the soul make it possible for the living organism to exercise these capacities? Well, Aristotle took over, and though in a modified form, Plato's claim that forms are causes. So these causes are these explanatory principles are actually internal to the living organism in question, and they play a causal role. That is, they're formal, final, and efficient causes. Now, to us, this is it's hard to adopt this kind of explanation exactly in this form because we tend to think of causation in a very different way. But nevertheless, I think this gives us an idea of how we would apply the hylomorphic apparatus together with the non-modal conception of essence to derive a modal profile. Okay. So just to conclude, I've taken you through the grounding problem, that is the problem of what explains the sortalish differences or the apparent sortalish differences between coincident objects, objects that occupy this very same region of space-time. And I've tried to motivate how hylomorphism can help provide a solution, hopefully even a distinctive solution to this problem, in response in particular to Alan Sidelle's recent challenge that hylomorphists are guilty of false advertising when they say that hylomorphism in fact contributes anything to a solution to the grounding problem. Thank you.